Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to dive right into a focused, systematic look at one of the absolute most complex and deeply rooted conflicts in modern history. We're talking about the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas that escalated so drastically in late 2023. Our goal here isn't to take sides, but to use the data, the historical records, and the actual geopolitical realities to clearly unpack what is happening on the ground and exactly why it's happening.
To really grasp today's headlines, we've got to systematically unpack the history. We'll start with Part 1, the October 2023 escalation. Then we'll move to 2, decades of shifting borders. 3, the rise of Hamas. 4, geopolitics and hidden motives. And finally, 5, the humanitarian toll.
So let's jump right into Section 1, the October 2023 escalation.
On the morning of October 7, 2023, the Palestinian militant group Hamas launched a massive surprise attack. They actually infiltrated Israel by land, sea, and air. And this number right here, 1195, that represents the Israelis and foreign nationals who were killed in that initial assault. On top of that, another 251 people were taken hostage. Pretty much across the board, experts and official sources described that day as an absolutely unprecedented intelligence failure for the Israeli government, completely breaching their high-tech security apparatus.
Right after that attack, Israel launched a massive counteroffensive into the Gaza Strip, which brings us to this truly staggering figure. According to official reports, over 72,000 Palestinians in Gaza have been killed since the Israeli offensive kicked off. And it's really important to mention that several studies in major medical journals like The Lancet point out that this figure is actually likely to be a significant undercount when you start factoring in indirect deaths from the conflict.
What started in a single day very quickly cascaded into a multi-year, multi-phase war. Moving from that initial invasion in late 2023, we saw an intense Israeli offensive into the southern city of Rafah in May 2024. Now, there was a temporary second ceasefire in early 2025, but the fighting picked right back up until a third ceasefire came into effect in October 2025. And that was following an agreement on the first phase of a U.S.-backed peace plan.
But how did we actually get to this explosive point? That brings us to Section 2, decades of shifting borders.
To answer that, we have to transition back in time. The modern territorial dispute essentially ignites right here in 1947. That's when the United Nations proposed a partition plan to divide the land. Israel accepted it, but Arab states rejected it, which directly triggered the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. That war resulted in the displacement of roughly 700,000 Palestinians, an event they referred to as the Nakba. Fast forward to 1967, and the Six-Day War radically changed territorial control all over again. And despite massive peace efforts over the years, like the 1993 Oslo Accords, permanent borders were just never truly finalized.
Just look at the stark contrast here. The promised two-state solution from that 1947 UN plan envisioned roughly 45% of the land going to Palestinians and 55% for a Jewish state, with Jerusalem placed entirely under UN control. But post-1967, the reality is totally different. Israel won a decisive military victory and ended up occupying the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and taking full control of Jerusalem. Decades of this shifting territorial control and ongoing military occupation basically created a powder keg of immense, long-standing friction.
So to understand who is currently administering Gaza, right in the middle of all this, we move to Section 3, the rise of Hamas.
For a very long time, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, led by the Fatah Party, was the dominant voice. They were the ones who eventually engaged in diplomacy and famously signed those Oslo Accords. But, when the peace processes stalled out and trust completely eroded, it left this massive vacuum for armed resistance. Hamas, operating primarily out of Gaza, completely rejected the peace process and stepped right into that vacuum, advocating for a strict, hardline military struggle against Israel.
It's really fascinating how Hamas evolved. They first emerged in 1987 during a Palestinian uprising known as the First Intifada. And there is a deep historical irony here. Official records and statements reveal that Israel actually provided some indirect support to the Islamic charities that birthed Hamas, hoping to use them to counter the influence of the PLO. But clearly, that backfired. Hamas grew incredibly popular, they won 74 seats in the 2006 Palestinian elections, and by 2007 they violently ousted Fatah and took full control of the Gaza Strip.
Now that we know the history of the borders and the factions, let's zoom out to the global stage. Section 4, geopolitics and hidden motives.
This leads us to a pretty pivotal question. Why did the October 7 attacks happen specifically when they did in late 2023? What was the actual immediate trigger? Well, Hamas leaders have explicitly cited the need to disrupt a very specific, monumental geopolitical event.
And that event was the normalization of diplomatic ties between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Here is where it gets wild. The U.S. was backing this massive new trade route called IMEC. It was designed to stretch from India to Europe, routing directly through Saudi Arabia and Israel. But for that to happen, those two nations had to normalize relations. On the flip side, however, Russia and Iran back a competing trade route called the NSTC, which bypasses Israel entirely. So by launching the October 7 attack, Hamas successfully derailed that Saudi-Israeli normalization, crippling the U.S.-backed trade route. And guess who that serves perfectly? Iran, a nation that heavily funds and arms Hamas. It's like a giant geopolitical puzzle.
And because of these foreign ties, what we see here is a textbook example of asymmetric warfare. That's basically a conflict between forces that are vastly different from one another. Israel possesses this massive conventional military superiority, highlighted by high-tech defense systems like the Iron Dome, which costs an absolute fortune to operate. Hamas counters this, not with standard military tanks, but with cheap rockets built from smuggled components, and an unbelievably extensive underground tunnel network, turning the super-dense urban environment of Gaza into an absolute guerrilla warfare nightmare.
But behind the trade routes, the strategy, and the politics, we have to transition back to the ground. Section 5, the humanitarian toll.
You really have to let this number sink in. According to UN and international assessments, approximately 90% of Gaza's civilian infrastructure has been destroyed or severely damaged. We're talking about essential services like water, electricity, and sanitation just completely collapsing. It's rendered massive parts of the Strip totally uninhabitable.
The situation on the ground is routinely described by international monitors as apocalyptic. The United Nations stated it incredibly plainly. The entire Palestinian population in North Gaza is at imminent risk of dying from disease, famine, and violence. A severely tightened blockade cut off basic necessities, and that led directly to a catastrophic hunger crisis and the systematic collapse of the healthcare system.
The scale of the fallout is just completely unprecedented. Almost the entirety of Gaza's population, 2.3 million Palestinians, have been forcibly displaced from their homes. On the other side of the border, over 100,000 Israelis were internally displaced at the height of the conflict due to rocket fire and security threats. Israel has detained thousands of Palestinians, and on the global legal stage right now, there are active, highly publicized proceedings at the International Court of Justice examining allegations of genocide against Israel, a classification that Israel and its allies firmly reject.
So, as we conclude this explainer today, we're kind of left staring at a cycle. We've seen how unresolved borders from back in 1947 fueled militant factions, how massive global trade wars pull strings from the shadows, and how millions of innocent civilians are the ones currently bearing the ultimate cost. So I'll leave you with this. After decades of shifting borders, proxy wars, and devastating human tolls, what does an unresolved future actually hold for the region? It's a heavy question, but one that definitely demands our continued attention. Thanks for learning with us today.